Heads up, Leaf fans. Matthew Knies could become a problem. To speak to that, here are Bryan Hayes and Craig Button. Knies is second on the Leafs in goals, on a pace for 41, making less than $1 million. Amazing value, but the 22-year-old needs a new deal. The recent pattern for the Leafs is to throw huge bucks at guys when they deliver like this. Do you see the Leafs backing up the Brinks truck again the way they have in the past, or has that ship now sailed, Hazer?
No, I don't think it's sailed, and I don't think it's ever a problem when you have really good players. And that's what Matthew Knies is right now. And he's a player that this new head coach, Craig Berube, truly believes in, Gino. This guy's pushing up on 20 minutes of ice time almost every night. He's playing with their best players 5-on-5. He's on the power play. He's killing penalties. You mentioned he's got 7 goals on the season. Secondary scoring's been an issue for this team for a long, long time. This isn't some run-of-the-mill depth player that you would expect to only pay $2 or $3 million. He deserves money. He deserves term, but it's complicated because of the other guys that you've talked about that precede him, where the Brinks trucks did show up and they had all that money. Matthews is getting paid. Nylander's getting paid. The question is what they do with Tavares and Marner. Now, Marner's a separate story, in my opinion, because obviously he's a better player than Matthew Knies. He's a superstar. He's already making a lot. He's going to continue to make a lot. There's a marketing component to that where ownership gets involved in a deal like that. But I think John Tavares and his future is tied to Matthew Knies. And whether or not they try to bridge him, because they might have to, he's restricted. There's no urgency here. Craig, you got a scenario here where Craig Berube and Brad Treliving and Brendan Shanahan, they're not calling Matthew Knies off the hook saying we need to sign you right now. There's no urgency to do that because he's restricted. But I do think it's valuable to get him done on a long-term deal if you believe he's going to pop. And I think he's popping right now. I think he'll continue to pop in the future. And if you don't give him that long-term deal now, you're probably going to have to give it to him in the future, and it's going to be for a lot more in the future. So if you're keeping Tavares and you're going to pay him, you probably have to bridge Matthew Knies. If Tavares isn't going to stick around, then I think the door opens for Knies signing long-term. And the way he's played early in his career, including in the playoffs, I think it's been very important for this team.
Matthew Knies is going to be a priority, and to me, he's not tied to John Tavares. They're very two different players. John Tavares' situation is separate and independent. Now, I will say this, Gino, there is never a problem when you have good players. I can guarantee no manager in the history of the game has ever complained about having too many good players. So Matthew Knies playing well, it's not a problem. And with respect to the Brinks truck, Matthews, Marner, and Nylander absolutely performed to the level of those contracts. Nylander outperformed his one when he signed a number of years back. Marner and Matthews were brilliant. So, backing up the Brinks truck, the Toronto Maple Leafs got massive value and the return that those players provided. Matthew Knies is a player that has shown that he can play with good players. Everybody thinks it's easy to play with good players. Oh, you play with Matthews and Martin. It's hard to play with good players. They demand a level of play from the guys that they play with. And if you can't play at that level, you're not going to be there. Matthew Knies has shown a great capability of that. I'm going to tell you the contract that I think that he should be getting. And I would be, if I'm Brad Treliving, I'd give it to him right tomorrow. I'd give him right to it this afternoon if I could. Matt Boldy of the Minnesota Wild. Matt Boldy and Matthew Knies are very similar type players in my view. Matt Boldy got the long-term contract. Every price for good players goes up. So your choice is, do you want to pay me a little bit now or do you want to pay me more in the future? I think for the Leafs, the better option is to pay Matthew Knies on a long-term contract, and John Tavares' contract will take care of itself at the appropriate time. Matthew Knies is a really good, strong player for the Leafs. Long-term Matthew Boldy contract, that would be the nice one in my view.
All right, how good is Matthew Knies? We've seen wingers have huge success playing with Matthews and Marner in the past, but Hayes, is there something different about Knies? Do you think he could drive his own line if he's asked to?
Well, I think, again, that's when you start to determine what that money is. And Craig mentioned Matthew Boldy, who's, a very good player, but it's not going to be double digits, and that's not what Knies is looking at here. And I think once you get to those type of superstar numbers, that would be the expectation. But I do think you need to consider the whole game here when it comes to Knies. Again, he's a power play guy. He's killing penalties, and he brings a different component to the team. He's a big boy that's physical, and I think that's mandatory as well. This team has lacked that in terms of who they've put their money into. And that's my point on Tavares, is John's not getting $11 million again. He's not getting $8 or $9 million, but he probably wants to be paid appropriately. And there's only so much money that can go around. But the stars that they have committed to all great players, all great talents. They all have a similar disposition and a similar style to an extent in terms of how they operate on the ice. I think Knies is a separator from that. What he is he's a big boy. He's willing to be physical. He's willing to go to the front of the net. I think he's a haul down below the goal line. So that's another important component here. So listen, not everyone's going to be a star. Not everyone's going to drive your team here. And again, he's somewhere in the middle class in terms of what that salary cap's going to be. Probably upper middle class. But that depth has been lacking here for a long time. They've been so committed to 4 guys, and then everyone else gets peanuts, and they struggle because of it. Where if they make an adjustment to that top, you have money for the middle. And I think the guy at the top of the middle can and will be Matthew Knies.
And Brian, that's exactly why I feel that Tavares and Matthew Knies are separate and independent. Now, that being said, I didn't just throw out Matthew Boldy because of his contract. I also threw out Matthew Boldy because of the way he plays. And he plays a game like it's almost a replica of what Matthew Knies plays. And what is that player? You don't have to drive a line. You have to drive play, Gino. And that's exactly what Matthew Knies does. He drives play. To Brian's point, on the power play, below the goal line, at the net. He's killing penalties. He's playing with good players. I don't have any question that Matthew Knies can play in different spots in your lineup because he's capable and he's smart enough, just like Matthew Boldy has done with the Minnesota Wild. So it's you don't have to drive your own line, but drive play. And I think that Matthew Knies is too good of a player, too driven, hard player that can absolutely impact the game in so many different ways. And yeah, it's nice to play with Matthews and Marner. You got to be good to play with those guys. But if you got to swing them into different spots, I have no doubt he can do that. And my final point on that is exactly what Brian said. You have a player like that, teams are coveting that. If you don't sign them long term and you try to bridge them, you better be careful because you might be facing an offer sheet.
Yeah, no kidding. Brad Treliving's got some tough decisions to make in the offseason. And you know what? Given the way Matthew Knies has been playing right now, that's a problem Treliving and the Leafs will be happy to have to deal with.